Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. I am going to be talking about grants. This session is an Ask Me Anything, a second one that I have done, and this one is all about grants. So with that, we are going to dive in. So first, let me introduce myself, especially if you're new to me or any of the webinars that I have given. I am Rachel Christine Woody, owner of Rachel Christine Consulting, and I'm a business owner, author, speaker, educator, advocate, and consultant. And for the purposes of our conversation today, I specialize in grant acquisition strategy. And I say it that way because it's more than just grant writing. It's the strategy that is required to come up with and structure grant projects that are competitive and that will be successful. It relies a lot on project management techniques, and it is more than just the writing that will help you win the grant. So that it's a whole grant acquisition process. So that's why I use grant acquisition and not just grant writing. Thank you for indulging me in that little spiel. I have 15 years of serving in archives, museums, and cultural heritage organizations all across the country and even some international projects. And my academic background is in archives management. So first of all, why am I doing this? And I like to use this slide when I do an Ask Me Anything. And for the purposes of the one we're doing today about grants is that I have been there. I have worked in places where there's little to no cash, which means there's not a great ability for us to do anything beyond keeping the lights on. And yet trying to take care of, manage, and share collections is expensive, and we need money to do what we do. The second one is that I have seen a lot. In 15 years of writing grants for myself and for others, I have applied to and won almost every type of grant imaginable for almost every type of project imaginable. So I've got a great breadth of experience I can share with you today. And then the third part is I care about you as my colleagues. Money has always been hard for us as collection workers to come by. And this year has made it even worse. Specific to grants, many of the grants, especially at the federal level, the competitive rate was already pretty cutthroat. In fact, there were a couple different grants that I worked on where the acceptance rate was 8%, which is not a high percentage, obviously, and that means that it's really competitive. There are a lot of people out there applying for grants and not a lot or sufficient money to go around to help all of us. And with 2020 and the economic collapse that has resulted, it has made it even harder for us. More competition, less relief funding. In fact, for those who are new to me, I've talked about this quite a bit, but the relief package that was passed in April funded 5% of the current ask by the museum and cultural industry. Just 5% of what they asked for was funded. And we are currently waiting for any other sort of relief packages to be passed since then. So my point being, there's not a lot of resources out there and there's a tremendous amount of need. And so not all of us are starting from an even playing field, and many of us don't have the luxury of having access to a development department, meaning we may not have grant writers in our organization that we have access to. And even if our organization has grant writers, they're usually not available for the people who do the work that we do. So that is a whole other conversation and a whole other webinar, but my point being, there's not a lot of resources out there for us, and so I am putting this out there to help as many of you as I can so that we can keep our collections going and our doors open. So how does this work? If you are new to Ask Me Anythings, or AMAs as they're called, the questions are pre-submitted, so I've gathered the questions ahead of time, and that gives me a chance to make sure I have resources ready for you and to answer them as effectively as I can. Second part is that I collate and anonymize the questions. This particular topic isn't necessarily as sensitive as one of the other Ask Me Anythings that I have done. However, it is still an area that you need to come and honestly share what your problems are and what your questions are, and this is a safe space to do that. Also, if there were similar questions, which for a couple of them there was some overlap, I went ahead and combined them. And then to remind you, at the bottom of this video, there is a chat function. I believe it's to the right, which the video is reversed, so over here. If you have follow-up questions to anything we're talking about, I will be in the chat since this is pre-recorded. This allows me to share links as I'm talking about them in the recording, but also to answer any of your follow-up questions in there. So please feel free to use that. And if you have advice or other resources, I encourage you to plug those in the chat as well. And another reminder at the bottom, and as you can see on the screen, there is a full screen option in the webinar viewing room. If you're watching the premiere with me live, the little default window is a little on the smaller side, so you can do full screen if you need it, or if that gives you trouble, this is premiering via YouTube, so you can head over to my YouTube channel and catch it there. Oh, and also I did want to mention closed captioning. YouTube does auto captioning, and that is available as the video premieres and then also as part of the recording. So a little disclaimer first, for this one with grants, it may go without saying, but each organization is different and strategies will vary. So the advice that I am sharing, it's based on my past experiences, which has been a diverse array of organizations and projects. However, because each of us are different in our setup and the resources we have available and the grants that whether or not they're a good fit, that will all be dependent on what your situation is. And so this is advice for you to apply as you see fit. And as a consultant, if you needed more specific advice, I would have to know more specifics about your organization and what it is that you're working with in order for me to actually give you some more pinpointed or accurate strategy. So if that is something you're interested in later, that is a service that I offer. But just so that everyone knows, this is advice based on my own experience, and it's up to you to sort of apply it in a way that makes sense for you. So I do want to mention before we jump in, because some of the questions I received were pretty, were like great fundamental questions to start with, but they are also questions that I had already answered in a mini course that I put together. And this course is free, which is why I'm not going to answer some of these questions in this Ask Me Anything, because you can pop over to my website and I'll drop the link in the chat and it'll be part of the YouTube description. But go get the Get Into Grants mini course if you haven't already. The lessons included in this mini course are grant funders and types, where to find grants, which is like probably the #1 question I get, which of course depends on where you are and what your situation is. Third one, which is not a question I get, but I wish that I got this one because it is an important part, and that's how to choose the right grant. And it goes into suitability versus eligibility, because just because we are eligible to apply for a grant does not mean it's a good fit, does not mean that we are necessarily suited for it. So that is perhaps one of the most important lessons for you to learn in the mini course. And then it will go over common application elements, tips to succeed, and proposal pitfalls to avoid that I have seen my clients make when I've done reviewing, and I have seen organizations make when I have served on grant review panels. So I've taken all of my experience and distilled it into this mini course to get you started. And if I haven't mentioned already, it is free, so please go and use it. And it's a great foundation for whatever sort of grant work you are doing. Even if you have written grants before, if you're feeling a little rusty or could use some more confidence in that area, this is a great place to start. And that gets us into our first question. So question #1, What aspect of grant application do you think is often overlooked? So I didn't just have one answer for this one, but I did narrow it down to my top three of what I most see overlooked when I work with my clients and also when I'm doing grant reviewing. The first one is forgetting that when we do a grant application, getting the money is to fund your solution. Getting the money is not the solution. And if there is a solution that you're looking for that the money is funding, that means you're supposed to have a problem that you are solving. And the reason why I'm saying it that way is because I often, for people who are new to grants, so it's a completely understandable first mistake to make, but they tend to jump right to, I need the money to do the thing without spending enough time talking about what problem they want to solve for. And for the granting agencies, that can be frustrating because they do want to help you. That is their job. They want to give money to help you, but they need to know what the problem is, because the problem, as far as they are concerned, is not that you don't have the money. It has to be different than that. The money is supposed to solve a different problem, and that problem is not that you don't have money. So keep that in mind. And that's something that I definitely spend some more time on in the book that I wrote, A Survivor's Guide to Museum Grant Writing. Don't worry, I'm going to talk about that in a little bit and send you a link for it. But this is like foundational part number one to constructing a good grant project, is to know what problem you're solving for. Second one, which is perhaps a little on the easier side to implement, and yet so many people aren't quite aware of it, is to consider that you need to work within the grant lexicon. And so lexicon is a gathering of words and a language that we use to describe and work within a certain profession or subject area. So as collection workers, archivists, curators, registrars, we have our own lingo, our own lexicon of the words and the acronyms that we tend to use. And it's the same thing for these granting agencies. So I need you to be sensitive and attuned to, when you are looking at a grant opportunity that you think you're going to apply for, you need to review and read through the grant opportunity and pay attention to the way it describes itself and describes the types of problems it's looking to solve, and start writing, like highlighting those words, writing those words down. That is the lexicon that I want you to work within when you start writing your grant application, because the grant reviewers, they are going to be working off of whatever the granting agency supplies them as their rubric, which means that they're going to be working off of the grant lexicon or the language that that granting agency is using. So you need to make sure you're using the same language to make it easier on the grant reviewer's part to flag that you are talking about the same thing and you are definitely checking that box. Even if you're using similar language, I often counsel my clients to use the exact language that is used within the grant opportunity notice, just to make that job easier on the grant reviewer's part, because if they automatically see those words, they can more easily flag that you are definitely a match, versus seeing synonyms for words and thinking, okay, well, maybe they're talking about digital preservation in the same way this granting agency thought of, but I'm not 100%. You do not want any room for error in that interpretation. So that's why I usually recommend that, and that's why it's usually overlooked. And then the third one that is often overlooked when people are putting together their grant proposals is the accountability factor. Again, there's so much focus on, we need money to solve our problems, which is not a great place to come from, at least in terms of competition. And so we really need to make sure that not only are we making a great case for why we are wanting to solve this problem, but then talking about how we are going to hold ourselves accountable and demonstrate that we have solved for that problem and have done what we said we were going to do. So this is thinking about how are we going to measure success? How are we going to keep ourselves accountable? Thinking about what those parameters look like and communicating that to the granting agency will help them feel more at ease that you are sincere in what it is that you want to do, and there are clear indications as to whether or not you did what you said you were going to do. So great question. Thank you. Next one. I'm not allowed to apply for grants on my own, but have to go through the university's 2 grant writers. How do you go about applying for grants when, due to institutional bureaucracy, you aren't allowed to apply for them and the people who have no familiarity with LAMS, which is library, archives, and museums? Let me get some water before I answer. So I definitely empathize with this one, whether it's a university or not. Many of the organizations that we work within, bureaucracy is inherent. And while it can be great that your organization actually does have grant writers on staff, like that is a benefit that some people don't have. What is also common, and what I mentioned at the beginning of this particular Ask Me Anything session, is that you, as the collection worker, usually don't have access to those grant writers because there's usually bigger, better, more important things that those grant writers are usually committed to already. And yet, because there are grant writers for your organization, you are then not really allowed to go and do your own thing, which can be very frustrating to say the least. So I definitely feel you on this one and have some suggestions. So first one up, it's time to cultivate your relationships and offer some gentle education. And what I mean by this is if you do need to work with these 2 grant writers, I recommend, if you haven't already, inviting them into your space, so to speak, uh, giving them a gentle education and orientation around what it is that you do, what your collections are, what problems you're encountering, what opportunities there are, helping to highlight like what is the cool stuff in your collection, what will help sell that grant proposal, what opportunities exist that the grant writers could get really excited about and be supportive of you. So I recommend doing that if you haven't already. The second one is do the homework and make the pitch. So clearly, if you're watching this and if you submitted that question, you are open to and interested in trying to do some of this, right? And that may be coming from necessity, that may be coming from curiosity. Either way, you are showing an inclination to help yourself, which I definitely give you respect for. And so I recommend doing some homework and doing some research in terms of what grants make sense for you, for what it is that you're trying to do, for your collections, for your organization, and do that research ahead of time and start coming up with some ideas in terms of how you could apply for those, like what the angle could be. So crafting that pitch. That way, when you're coming to the grant writers who are probably already overcommitted, you already have a list of actionable things and how you could approach them. And that usually helps lower the barrier to entry with engaging these grant writers and working with you. And this also has the benefit of showing that you are an expert. And while you may not be an expert in grants per se, you know enough to know what might be more appropriate for you and your collection, and that you're willing to do some of the work to help make the grant writer's job easier. So these should all be things that are interesting and beneficial to the grant writer and will help, hopefully, make them more open to working with you since you're already being such a great collaborative partner. And then the third thing I would recommend is to, if you haven't already, try explaining to your boss, the grant writers, whoever else needs to listen, that For the LAM specific grants, it requires LAM specific knowledge, which may be obvious, but not enough where this point doesn't need saying. Um, Grant writers, they have their expertise, absolutely, but so do you. And it would make the grant writers' jobs easier and it would make them be more successful at their job if they work with you as a partner on this. So, as you can see, these 3 points work together to do some education, to do some outreach, to make, gesture of goodwill, show you're a good and knowledgeable partner, and hopefully all work together to have those grant writers consider you as a partner in this and want to engage and work with you. From my own experience in one of the locations I worked in, actually two of the locations I worked in, there were grant reviewers or grant writers on staff that, of course, I had to work with and go through to make sure that there wasn't like cross competing purposes, etc. And after working with them just once and showing how much I knew, showing the expertise I brought, doing those things, the things that I recommended, all helped them very quickly get on board to see me as an equal in terms of expertise and to want to work with me because they know that I had the ability to see problems as opportunities and how to talk about those as opportunities in an appealing way that makes people want to give us money to do those things. So I know it is not an easy job, and I know you've probably attempted to do some variation of this, but I do encourage you to keep trying and keep doing what you need to do and literally demonstrate that you can be a good asset in this regard and help bring in money. Next question. What is a strategic plan? Oh, I'm sorry. Why is a strategic plan necessary for some applications, and isn't it just a restatement of why you want the grant? So first of all, I want us to think about, what do we mean when we say strategic plan, or what does the granting agency mean when they're saying strategic plan? Typically, strategic plan it's like organization wide, and it's got like your organization's mission and then like four pillars or themes or core values or whatever your organization calls them, that help support that mission, but then break down further into, okay, of our four core values or whatever, this is what this looks like, and these are the activities that we're doing that supports that then goes to help us reach our mission, kind of thing. So as far as granting agencies asking for that, it's usually a way for them to vet whether or not your organization is actually a match for that granting agency, because obviously granting agencies want to fund and support things that support their mission and strategic plan. And so they need to know that you guys are on the same side or what have you, in terms of like, yes, our missions align, our strategies for how we want to get there are complementary. So that's usually what they're looking for, and whether or not that's submitting your strategic plan or pointing to some specific things in your strategic plan, it also helps them trigger that and verify that the grant project you're proposing does help support your larger organization's overall strategic plan. Because another thing the granting agencies don't want to do is to fund projects that ultimately don't support your organization's mission and are just sort of out there and not connected to anything more concrete. And there's some bigger sustainability issues as to why that is, but essentially they want to make sure that whatever they're funding not only matches their mission as the granting agency, but that the project you're proposing matches your mission and what your organization says that it is going to do. The second reason they usually ask for this is to help figure out what the money is for. Depending on what the grant is and depending on what type of organization you're in, this is another way to coax out like, okay, well, what is your strategic plan and how does this part fit in? Where's the grant money going? So it sometimes helps give them a lay of the land. And then, does there need to be a line from the organization's mission and strategic plan to the grant? And so this is if the granting agency is asking for like, do you need to link your strategic plan? Is it like a supplemental file that you need to upload? Uh, there are usually in the introductory parts of applications that want you to state what your organization's mission is and how that project ties to the mission. So depending on how it asks for it, just make sure that you address it and realize that that is why they are asking for it. Next question. Any advice for someone starting a university archives from scratch? We have a physical room and items to go into the archives, but that's it. We need fixtures, processing materials, scanners, etc. And yes, I definitely know what you're talking about. So a little background here. I started my career at the Smithsonian and I was at the Freer Sackler Gallery of Art, which I believe they are now calling the National Asian Art Museum. And the archives there was somebody who was head of archives. They didn't have an archivist for at least a few years. And so a lot of the regular archivist activities had been pretty dormant, not a lot of outreach activity happening. And so they were bringing me on board to help revive that program. And then when I went to work at Linfield, even though the college was 150 years old plus, I was the first archivist. There had been some history projects and some things done, but never by a trained professional, and never was there one in the archives. So both were fairly big jobs to either revive a program or start a program from scratch, which also meant that if there was a budget, which for one of them there wasn't for a while, that it was pretty minimal. And so any supplies that I needed, any like if I wanted to try and hire student interns or employees, that all costs money, right? So I have been there. And so based on that, I have a couple different strategies and advice for you. So the first one is education. And you may have already done this, but we often, especially as subject matter experts and people actually on the ground dealing with this, need to educate up. And so many organizations, if they are adding in an archives or trying to get an archives program started that was kind of already there, but not really, they really have no concept of how much energy, structure, and money is needed to have a fully functional archives or museum collection program and what it takes to get that going, let alone maintaining. And because they are collection items, they need special storage, whether that's containers or climate controlled storage room, let alone collections management systems and digitization equipment. So all of these things cost money. I run into so many situations, both as a traditional employee and as a consultant, where the people who were in charge of getting that started, that were not archivists, but were in charge of hiring archivists to get it started, really had no accurate idea of how much that costs. So we need to start out with some education there and sharing some numbers. And part of that education process that I have found to be helpful and effective is actually doing some peer comparisons. One of the first things that I did when I was at Linfield was take a look at what my neighboring archives looked like. What sort of size space did they have? What budget lines did they have? How many FTE did they have? And how that compared to what was on the ground at Linfield. So that can sometimes be a very like easily conveyed slash comparison tool that can also help hopefully be a bit of an instigator into helping you get the resources you need. My second suggestion is to help break it out, especially if you're trying to start an archives from scratch. It means that the amount of stuff that you need is a lot. And sometimes you just can't get it all at once. So breaking it out and moving into that next step, prioritizing what it is that you need based on what your situation is, based on what is happening with the collections, based on what other resources you might have access to, will determine how you should be prioritizing that collection. Maybe it makes sense that the priority is just getting them in a different storage room and different containers, or maybe they're in pretty good condition, but you have a tied-to resource where you could get a collections management system in earlier than maybe you could buy supplies, and that makes sense, and so you do that instead. So prioritize based on what your situation is. And then for the fourth piece of advice, try and build synergy and incentives. So if there are partners that are particularly interested, that bring resources to help you do a part of a project, if there's a way to incentivize, whether it's your larger organization or a donor or community, if there are projects that are particularly interesting or they really make sense for you to do, like if it's an anniversary, for example, finding what those things are and pursuing those first will help make your job easier. And then you can go back and ask for other things that you need. Next question. We need money for everything, but I know grants don't like to cover operational costs. Is there a creative way around this? So a little similar to our last question, but I do want to address this one specifically because whether you're an emerging archives or collection program or not, all of us have operational costs that we need to cover, and in way too many cases, unfortunately, we don't have the operational budget to meet all of those operational costs. And so for us, what really should be funded by our organization every year, sometimes that's just not the reality available to us. And so seeking donor funding or grant funding to help fill the gaps, essentially. And so because granting agencies do tend to frown upon funding operational costs because legitimately it's something your organization should be supporting, there's some creative ways that we can go about this. And one of the ways is to break them out in phases. So for example, if your organization should be funding a yearly allotment for archival supplies, but you just don't have the budget this year for that, then pick a collection that you want to work on that you could get grant funding for to help fund and buy some of those supplies. Another way to do this is you need to buy collections management software, which has an annual cost with it, but if you're able to put together a project and choose a collection to work on for that year, sometimes you can package it as a more discrete thing that may have operational annual components to it. And yet it's still this discrete project that the granting agency can feel good about pointing to and identifying, yes, we funded that. Another thing to consider is working with your organization to develop a long-term plan to cover these costs. Operational costs, by their very nature, should be funded by your organization. And if your organization can't fund those things, then there should really be some reassessment as to what's happening, which is a whole other webinar in terms of where your income streams come from and how you're prioritizing your budget. But for this case, even if you're able to get grant money or donors to cover a portion of your work, you were not going to be able to do that year after year. One, you shouldn't, but two, the granting agencies aren't going to be interested in funding it beyond just that 1 year. And so your organization, you're going to need to work with them to have a plan of, okay, if I can get a donor or a granting agency to fund this piece for this year, you as my organization need to commit to the annual cost of that for the next at least 5 years or something like that. So make sure you're having that conversation as well. And then another piece of advice is I usually like to work with both donors and grants to put together and help supplement what these costs are. For example, like both donors and granting agencies want to fund the bright, shiny, pretty things that they can splash up on their press releases and on their websites to say, hey, we funded this great, really pretty, shiny, interesting thing. Nobody wants to fund the rebinding of a book or like some of the more boring or tedious. I mean, like you and I, we find this interesting and we know it's important, but maybe not the donors or the granting agency. So usually what I do is I make this a larger project where there are bright, shiny things, and then there's also like structural, maybe boring things for them, but they have to come together. And while the grant money might technically fund the boring things, it's still tied to this larger project with a shiny outcome. And so the granting agency can still point to that shiny outcome, even though they funded like the boring structural thing, and feel good about it. So that's how I sort of creatively get around that and have everybody feel good about it and have us still be able to do our jobs. Next question. I volunteer for a nonprofit organization that has virtually no money. Many of the grants we see require a cash match. If we have no money for a match, how can we apply for grants? Which is a good and common question. So my first piece of advice is to get creative. And part of what I mean by that is while you may not have cash lying around to do a match, you do still have access to cash usually in a couple different areas. And so one of those areas might be in your donor and community. So for example, if you have a donor that tends to donate $1,000 annually to your organization, tying that donor's donation to your project can sometimes be used as that cash match. Some of the granting agencies do require the money come from the organization itself, but not always, or there's, ways that accounting wise, technically the donor's money goes to your organization and is your organization's money. So anyway, working with those networks and money that may exist sort of adjacent to your organization and using those as your cash match. Another way that we can sometimes do this is the operational resources you're putting towards the grant project counts. So for example, if you're working on a digitization project and you're working in a collections management system that has an annual licensing fee, if you're using up to a quarter of the storage for this new project, then a quarter of whatever that annual licensing fee can sometimes be used as a cash or in-kind match, depending on how strict they are about cash. In terms of, okay, yes, the museum in this case is covering the collections management system, and we can, write off a quarter of it for this project. Another thing to think about is pairing grants, and this does get a little more complicated and is only something I recommend for people who are regularly writing grants or it has already had some success writing grants. And what I mean by pairing grants is if you're chunking your project out into phases, applying for grants that could help fund one of those phases and timing it out in a way where, okay, I'm going after this grant to do a collection assessment. And then after that, based on the assessment, I'm going after this grant to implement the recommendations. And so when you're writing to those grants, while you don't have the cash in hand, you can at least point to and acknowledge, I have written to these grants. We hope to use these for the second piece of the project or the first piece of the project. that is a little tenuous, but there are some strategic ways we can go about it. For example, one of the foundations that I worked with, I actually reached out to ahead of the application and said, look, we're applying for this grant over here. We'll know the decision by this date. If we get it, do you commit to funding our second phase of the project? Explaining that, hey, grant one wants a cash match. Your foundation also requires a cash match. Can we pair these grants together and actually be able to do this? And so it does take some conversation, it does take some finagling. Obviously, it depends on you getting both of those grants, but there are ways to do it. So putting those in place, if you've had experience in doing so, it's worth trying. Another thing to think about is some offer in-kind matches. So cash match usually means they want cash that your organization is putting up. But there's some leniency depending on the grant you're applying for in terms of if it also includes some in-kind match. Different organizations classify these differently, but one example that I usually see that is also considered a cash match is when a certain staff's percentage of FTE that they would be working on this project for can count towards the organization pays that person's portion of that FTE, and therefore that organization's putting the cash up for it. Another thing to think about is for in the instances where we're trying to set up archives or collection organizations, if we're trying to increase our capacity of what we're doing, if we're trying to get a grant to help fund and acquire equipment or something, that training, anything that helps us do our job better and more efficiently, or perhaps expand the job we're doing, those all sort of revolve around what granting agencies consider capacity building. And there are grants out there, especially at the federal level, that have things called organizational capacity grants or capacity building grants. And those are ones that I recommend you look into if you're looking at starting at the beginning, trying to get some programs going, needing that help building your capacity. There is actually a whole category out there that is specific to capacity building. Next question. My director thinks grants are the be-all, end-all for fundraising and wants me to spend most of my time filling out grant applications. But I know that grants are hard to get, and I honestly don't have the time or inclination to go after them. What advice do you have to navigate this situation? Which is a common one. You are not alone. So education and honesty, and you may have done this already, but if your director hasn't applied for grants before, if your director hasn't done your job before, they probably don't have an accurate idea of what's involved with either of those things. So first of all, if you're in this webinar, it's usually because you are a collection worker and are a subject matter expert and a technical expert in what it is that you do, and you likely already have a very full-time job. And so to have the director or whomever put grant writing on top of the work you're already doing, that's too much work, right? And if you have never written grants before, if it's not something you've learned how to do, even if you've learned how to do it, if it's not something you enjoy, all of those reasons are good reasons for you to not be doing it. And so having an honest and informative conversation with your higher up, whoever is asking you to do it, in terms of what your time, interest, and capabilities really are. Because if you don't have the time, inclination, or background to do it successfully, then it really isn't a good decision on the director's part to still try and make you do it anyway, because you're not going to be successful and you are essentially wasting time and money, which nobody should want, including your boss. Related to that, have a conversation about what the payoff is. So do an ROI, a return on investment calculation. And specifically, what I mean is for directors who want you to go after grants, take a look at a couple of grants that might be appropriate for you and do a bit of a mental calculation on how long it would actually take you to fill out that grant. If it is a federal grant, even some of the lighter ones, it takes easily 24 to 40 hours of work time to put those together. And that is speaking as someone who regularly does those. And if you're new to doing those types of grants, it is going to take you 3 times as long easily. So having sort of that estimate of like, okay, director, you want me to apply for this grant? It's going to take me at least 40 hours to do that. And if the grant's only going to be for like $5,000 and not $500,000, it is not worth the ROI. So do the calculation because sometimes the math just doesn't make sense. And to my next point, does it make sense to spend money to make money if it can be done smarter and more strategically? So, yes, if you can do it smarter and strategically, if you can be efficient about it, great, it makes sense. If you're interested in writing grants, if the grant that you and or the director want to go after makes sense and you're excited about it, if you've done grant writing before and feel confident in it, then yes, you should do those. But the fact that you asked the question the way you did makes me think that at least one of those things is not true for you. And so this might be an instance where it makes sense to hire a consultant if you don't have a grant writer on staff or on the board. Hire someone like me who has that experience, who can do the LAM expertise with the grant acquisition expertise matchup and write that grant for you at least 3 times quicker than you could if you were new to grant writing. And sometimes that return on investment makes so much more sense to cut me a check for a modest amount on a focused project than it does for you to try and learn how to do grant writing and also try and apply for a federal grant for the first time, which I don't recommend, and then not get the grant also. As an aside, like there's no guarantee to getting grants, of course, we can never guarantee that, but there are ways to make sure that you are set up for success, and having that expertise and having that experience is part of that requirement. And if you don't have it, if your boss doesn't have it, you need someone who does have it if you're going after grants. Question: how do you get started learning about what grants are and how to write a grant proposal? Courses have been helpful, but many assume the student has a basic knowledge of grants. Truth. So you were definitely asking the right person. As I mentioned, grant acquisition strategy is one of my 3 passion areas. So take a grant course tailored to LAMs. So I mentioned that having that library, archive, museum expertise is required because you will be going after LAM grant opportunities. So you can't just have a grant writer generalist come in and all of a sudden know what your collections are, what it means, what your needs are, what those mean, let alone how much they cost. So you need to take courses that are specific to grants that are specific to you. Get my free e-copy of my book, which there'll be a link in a slide coming up, of Survivor's Guide to Museum Grant Writing. If you're a physical hard copy book person, you can get the hard copy on Amazon, but I think it costs like $30 or something. Next one, sign up for that free mini course that I introduced in the beginning, because that does cover all of the grant foundational pieces that are often missing when people are teaching generalist grant courses. And for all of the courses that I provide, they're for people like you. They're not for anybody else. They're for people who work with collections. So you know that all of the content that is in there is appropriate for you. And then there is the idea of competitive grant project construction. So We spent time on questions and foundational grant stuff. You should definitely take the mini course to learn the basics, but the very next step to that is knowing how to construct a competitive, compelling, successful grant project. And it is not as straightforward or as easy as you would think. So once you've taken the mini course, there is a full suite of lessons and examples and templates, and you can get into those. The link members.rachelchristine.com/grant services is one of the intro pages to that. There will be more link reminders, I think, just a little further on. So you have plenty of access to those links if you are interested. So what were those resources again that we covered through this Q&A? So there's the Survivor's Guide to Museum Grant Writing, and that's the direct link to send you to go get that e-copy of the book. Again, it's free. There's no reason not to go get that e-copy, and it's a great like beginning to end, like how to get you started kind of guide. So please go get that, especially if you are the one that has to / wants to start writing grants. The second resource that we just talked about, that Get Into Grants course, it's a mini course. It's, I think, an hour, maybe 2 hours worth of recorded content broken up into very like topic specific bite size or snack size lessons to help you. And there's examples, templates, etc. as part of that. And then for the third resource is the Going from Zero to Winning with Grants. This is the full course, which means there are at least 18 different lessons. This particular one was based off of my 4-hour in-person workshop. So there is at least 4 hours of actual lesson content, and I think more than that now. But this one comes with the entire workbook, exercises, templates, audio and video recordings of the lessons, everything you could need. This particular one focuses on the grant project idea construction, which so many people need help with, and is usually the first place I start before we even get into like grant writing or style. So if you are new to grants, get the book, do the mini course, get that foundation. If you are not new to grants, or if you've already used those resources, which many of you have, thank you, then you're ready to dive into the full course. And as you are watching this webinar, I do have a code to take the course cost down from $199 to $149, and the code is I got this, no spaces, and it will be in the email you get tomorrow with all of the links, so don't worry about missing it here. To talk about services, because we did touch on a couple times bringing in an expert, and it really does help make sense if you don't have the time, if you don't have the background, if you're going after a very large, complicated grant, and if you want your staff and department to eventually start writing their own grants, bringing an expert in to help do the training, to help lead through some of that strategy and discussion, to help review or write the first few grants for you. Those are all options available to you when you work with a grant acquisition consultant. And so depending on where you are, at least for me as a consultant, I have worked with clients in a variety of ways, whether that is doing all of the project construction, writing, applying, and then managing beginning to end, or if that's just you wrote the grant, I review it and provide feedback in terms of competitiveness. Or you got the grant, but you don't have enough staff to actually manage that project. So I've done all of those different types of things depending on what you need. Another thing to think about is workshops for if you're part of a regional organization, if you're doing conferences. I do workshops, at least pre-COVID, all over the country, and have now moved them online, which is the third part, which is courses. So if you ever want on-site training, if you ever want to do an on-site workshop for your field, those are available, and happy to talk with you about those as well. And again, the website members.rachelchristine.com/grant services. I talk all about all of these things in terms of how we could work together, and I'm very flexible in terms of what it is that you need and how I can help support you. So if you are interested in those, that's where they live. And just a heads up, there's a new course coming in January 2021, which I can't believe it's already 2021 almost. And that is Growing Grant Success with Better Grant Writing. This particular one is building off of Going from Zero to Winning. So that one was focused on grant project construction. This one is focused on grant writing, and it's not about your writing style. It's about the writing components that need to be in your narrative that help make things clearer and more compelling for those grant reviewers. So it gets into the mechanics of the grant proposal and how to convey pieces of information that are required in those proposals in a very clear and competitive way. So I'm very excited for this one. I've not had a chance to do it as much as the other ones, so happy to have you join me on that one. It is probably worth taking the other one first if you are very new to grant writing, but if you've done grants before and you're interested in jumping into this one, then I welcome you in this course as well. And with the same code that I got this, you can get $50 off, so it'll be $149. Both of those codes are good for the month, so I think they're good until November 30th. All right, so what's next? Link to the recording will be sent to everybody who registered, so you'll get an email tomorrow. Also, if you find my YouTube channel, you can subscribe there and you'll be notified of when new live content goes up there. Eventually, there will be a blog post with Q&A summary. I try and do these like the week after, but it's been busy and a lot of current events happening lately, so I'll get to that as soon as I can. But any of the questions and stuff that we're doing in the chat, I try and capture a snapshot of those and we'll do a summary. And then for the third piece, I have a couple more webinars planned for the end of this year. So if you enjoyed this session, please let me know. That helps me know what is interesting to you and what more I should do. The very next webinar is actually going to be next week. It's November 12th, I believe, next Thursday. And it's Breaking with Tradition, and it's connecting audiences to collections with new types of access. And that one I am co-presenting with Bridget Catherine Pride, and I'm very excited to have that session with her. There should be, if you're in the webinar premiere with us right now, there should be further down this page an actual registration window if you are interested in joining. And then if you're not already on the newsletter, please do join, because any of these webinars that I plan on doing, they're always offered to my community first, and any other sort of resources, it's my community first access granted before I share them with a broader audience. And with that, thank you. These are other ways you can connect with me: Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn on that far left side. Instagram does occasionally have the corgi pictures. Otherwise, it's mostly work, but and then Twitter and LinkedIn are solely work. If you need more resources, I have resources available, rachelchristine.com/resources. And then, of course, if you're looking to engage me in my services, courses, workshops, whatever, members.rachelchristine.com is where you can find most of that information. And with that, I am going to leave this webinar recording for another 5 to 10 minutes or so, and in the chat box, address and finish up any of my question answer sessions with you there. So with that, I'm going to thank you so much for joining me. I look forward to seeing you again. And if there are topics that you want me to cover in 2021, I haven't started listing or scheduling those yet, so let me know. And I would love to hear what would be helpful to you and prioritize accordingly. So thank you again, and I'll see you soon.